The 19th century was a transformative period marked by political, economic, and socio-cultural upheavals worldwide and in the Philippines. These changes created the context in which Jose Rizal emerged as a nationalist and reformist. This module explores the political, economic, and socio-cultural situations of the 19th century, analyzing their impact on the rise of Filipino nationalism and Rizal's concept of national identity. By understanding the link between individual and society, you will better appreciate how Rizal's life and works were shaped by and responded to the challenges of his time. Good day everyone and welcome. Our discussion for today will be focusing on the political situations during the 19th century. To understand the rise of Filipino nationalism, it is essential to examine the political situations both globally and locally during the Spanish colonial period. Key global movements like liberalism, alongside local issues such as the oppressive Spanish government, the frailocracy, and human rights abuses, fueled growing discontent among Filipinos. These political factors greatly influenced Jose Rizal's ideas of justice, equality, and reform, shaping his vision for an independent and self-governing Philippines. To begin, let us discuss the world political scenario during the time of Jose Rizal. The following world political situations contributed to Rizal's context and the development of Filipino nationalism, which include the rise of liberalism, the Bourbon reforms, and the Cadiz Constitution. The rise of liberalism in the 18th and 19th centuries significantly influenced the development of Filipino nationalism. In Europe, liberal ideas such as individual freedoms, equality, and democratic participation spread during the Enlightenment, challenging the absolute power of monarchs and promoting the notion of constitutional governance. These ideas reached the Philippines, especially during the Spanish colonial period, where Filipinos were exposed to Western ideals through European literature, reformist movements, and revolutionary ideas. Such exposure fueled calls for reforms in the colonial government, laying the groundwork for Filipino intellectuals like Jose Rizal to advocate for a more equitable society. Rizal himself was influenced by liberal values, which he integrated into his writings and his vision of a Filipino identity based on equality, justice, and freedom. Liberalism inspired the growing discontent against colonial rule, contributing to the rise of nationalist sentiments among Filipinos. In addition, the Bourbon reforms, which were implemented by the Spanish crown in the late 18th century, aimed to consolidate power, increase revenue, and strengthen Spanish control over its colonies, including the Philippines. However, these reforms often had adverse effects on Filipinos, as they led to higher taxes, greater exploitation of local resources, and a tighter grip of the Spanish colonial government. One of the reforms was the establishment of a more centralized government, which curbed the autonomy of local leaders and the influence of the church. While intended to improve colonial administration, these measures resulted in increased dissatisfaction among Filipinos, as they were further subjected to exploitation and political disenfranchisement. This discontent played a significant role in the rise of nationalist sentiments, and it influenced Rizal's criticisms of the Spanish colonial system in his writings, where he called for reforms and the recognition of Filipino rights. Cadiz Constitution of 1812 made also an impact to the development of and Rizal's vision of Filipino nationalism. This constitution is a progressive document aimed at modernizing Spain and its colonies, introduced the idea of a constitutional monarchy and granted certain rights to individuals. Although it was not fully implemented in Spain's colonies, its principles of constitutional governance and the recognition of human rights resonated with Filipino reformists. The introduction of the Constitution stirred the Filipino elite, especially those in Manila, to demand representation in the Spanish Cortes or Parliament, and greater participation in the political process. Rizal's advocacy for Filipino rights and representation in the Spanish government drew inspiration from the ideals of the Cadiz Constitution. The document emphasized civil liberties and the concept of equality, ideas that aligned with Rizal's vision for a reformed Philippines, where Filipinos would be treated equally to Spaniards. The political upheavals happening in Europe reached the Philippines and developed local factors that contributed to Rizal's dream of Filipino nationalism. These local political scenarios are structure of the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines, the power of the frailocracy, the abuses of Spanish officials, the instability of colonial administration, and the abolition of Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes. Our discussion begins with the impact of the structure of the Spanish government to the development of Filipino nationalism and the Rizal's nationalistic spirit. The Spanish colonial government in the Philippines was marked by a centralized system of control, with Spanish officials exercising absolute authority over the islands. The Governor-General, appointed by the Spanish crown, held considerable power, and the natives had little political influence. While there were some reforms during the late 19th century, the Filipino people largely remained excluded from positions of power and were treated as second-class citizens. This oppressive governance led to widespread frustration and a desire for greater autonomy. Rizal's concept of nationalism was driven by his recognition of the injustices inflicted by the colonial government. He sought a society where Filipinos could govern themselves, with equal rights and representation in the colonial system, a vision that would later inspire the revolution against Spanish rule. Another factor that contributed to the rise of Filipino nationalism is the frailocracy, or the dominance of Spanish religious orders in the Philippines. The Spanish friars, who held enormous power in the colonial system, controlled vast tracts of land, educational institutions, and local governance. This created a situation where the Filipino people were subordinated to both secular and religious authorities, resulting in systemic exploitation and oppression. The friars were seen by many Filipinos as symbols of colonial tyranny, as they not only imposed Spanish Catholicism but also played an active role in the political and social subjugation of the native population. Rizal's works, particularly Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, highlighted the abuses of the friars and called for the separation of church and state, which became a key component of Filipino nationalism. Religious orders were not the only ones who abused the Filipinos. Spanish officials had their fair share of abuses which triggered growth of Filipino nationalism. Under Spanish colonial rule, Filipinos were denied basic human rights and were subjected to systemic injustice. They were often treated as inferior to Spaniards and faced discrimination in the legal system. For instance, natives were denied the right to hold high positions in the government and were often subjected to arbitrary punishment. Additionally, the Spanish authorities implemented policies that denied Filipinos access to education, land ownership, and economic opportunities. These abuses fueled the desire for reform and justice, both of which became central to Rizal's idea of Filipino nationalism. His writings called for the recognition of the dignity and rights of Filipinos and the need for a fair and just legal system. The prevalence of these abuses contributed significantly to the growing nationalist movement, with Filipinos demanding not only reform but also independence. The instability of the Spanish colonial administration in the Philippines is another factor that contributed to the growth of Filipino nationalism. The unstable administration of Spaniards was due to frequent changes in leadership, corruption, and the lack of a coherent governance structure. This instability weakened the effectiveness of colonial rule and created opportunities for Filipino intellectuals and reformists to challenge the system. Rizal, who was highly critical of the inefficiency and corruption within the Spanish government, used his writings to advocate for a more just and organized society. His concept of nationalism was grounded in the belief that a stable and just government, free from corruption and mismanagement, was essential for the flourishing of the Filipino people. The instability of colonial administration thus contributed to the growth of nationalist ideas that sought to replace the existing system with a more equitable and functional government. The abolition of Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes was a significant point that also contributed in heightening Filipino patriotism. Although the Cadiz Constitution allowed for the possibility of colonial representation, the Spanish government consistently failed to grant Filipinos the political representation they deserved. This exclusion from the Spanish Cortes reflected the colonial authorities' disregard for the interests of Filipinos and further fueled discontent. Rizal and other reformists advocated for Filipino representation, believing that it was crucial for the Filipino people to have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. This demand for representation was an important aspect of Rizal's nationalist vision, which called for the Philippines to be recognized as a legitimate and equal part of the Spanish Empire, with its people granted the same rights as Spaniards. The political situations during the Spanish colonial period, both globally and locally, played a pivotal role in shaping Filipino nationalism. Global movements like liberalism and constitutional reforms introduced ideas of freedom and equality, while local injustices such as freilocracy, abuses by Spanish officials, and the instability of the colonial administration fueled widespread discontent. These dynamics inspired reformists like Jose Rizal to advocate for justice, equality, and representation, laying the foundation for the nationalist movement. Ultimately, these political factors not only exposed the flaws of colonial rule but also united Filipinos in their pursuit of autonomy and self-determination. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you found our discussion insightful and inspiring. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next topic. Stay curious, stay passionate, and I'll see you in our next discussion. Take care and see you soon.